Okay, today we're looking at U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America during the Cold War. The main point of reference, of course, is the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution had a huge impact on foreign policy thinking in the United States. After all, that we had a successful communist takeover in the Western Hemisphere. As far as the U.S. leadership was concerned, going all the way back to Kennedy, anything was on the table to get rid of Cuba. So we had the Bay of Pigs fiasco. We had different ideas of how to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis from a very coercive, very military perspective. We learned about that in the previous module. As far as the United States leadership was concerned during the Cold War, they really had two different approaches. The first one was done under Kennedy, the Alliance for Progress. This really was sort of a soft power approach. The idea was the best way to prove Latin American countries from communist takeovers was to make them part of the international capitalist system. So incorporate them into international political economy. That was seen as the main, it was development aid, modernization, the idea that poor countries were susceptible to communist takeover. By making them, help them develop, we would actually make sure that they would be immune from communist takeovers. That, of course, did not necessarily end other coercive methods the US has used, so that was the contradiction. Dependency theory really is the intellectual stream. Dependency theory, structural theory, neo-Marxist theory really came out of Latin America, late 70s, early 80s, and that really was a continuation of Marxist approach to international relations. That looking at back in imperial times, colonial times, colonies were being exploited by colonial powers in Europe. They merely acted as markets for secondary goods and hadn't actually were forced to buy and import manufactured goods from the core, from Europe. So that kept them in a constant state of dependency because they were not being developed. They merely acted as markets, providing raw materials to Europe and then having to sell again manufactured goods from Europe. Dependency theorists or dependistas argue that this was the case during that time, during the Cold War, and many would say that that's still the case, that looking at the North and South divide, we have the powerful North, Europe, parts of Asia, the United States, Canada, which have the means of economic power as well as military and political power. And the global South is still in this state of dependency. So this is the intellectual and of course also political movement which developed during that time. Now again, the Cuban Revolution was a big deal because Cuba itself was an unlikely candidate for a communist takeover. It really transformed the entire movement of socialists as well as communists in Latin America because popular forces can win a war against an army, regular military, and it's not necessary to wait until all conditions are there for the revolution to happen. The insurrection, the military insurrection, can actually create them. And of course, in underdeveloped Latin America, the countryside became the basic area for armed fighting. So this was, a regular, communist revolution is, the overthrow of the bourgeoisie by the working class. And then you have a new political establishment, a new regime, new political system. This was the way around, that you had, a highly politicized, guerrilla movement, militias overthrowing a regime and then instigating political revolution. So after Kennedy's death, Lyndon Johnson, he wanted to continue to embrace this soft power approach with Alliance for Progress. This was the idea that by incorporating them, by helping them modernize, develop economically, we can bind them closer to us, but also we make sure that they will not become communist allies. this somewhat changed with the new Undersecretary of Latin American Affairs, Thomas Mann. He really rejected the idea that to democratize these countries, this is blatantly absurd given the socioeconomic situation in Latin America at the time. We will continue with economic growth projects, and certainly we continue with U.S. exports and maintaining and protecting our economic and business interests, but we will actually have to be more flexible and also somehow come to terms that we might have to deal and cooperate and accept undemocratic or military regimes. So again, this cooperation was deemed necessary, and overall, this entire idea that promoting democracy in Latin America was really seen as a futile enterprise, according to the State Department at the time. What we've seen after that, so we're really looking at late 60s, 70s, 80s, that the military became then the most loyal, most seen as far as the US was concerned, stable ally in Latin America. So again, as the United States put a lot of emphasis and a premium on countering insurgencies which could have overthrown governments and made them socialist or communist, the idea was we have to make sure that these military regimes have all the resources, the training, the support they can get from us in order to withstand insurgency. So this became the most seen as the most effective ally, the best organized institution by virtue of being a military. And be looking at the 70s, it was very evident as intelligence reports came in that these military regimes were committing human rights violation, war crimes, even, and really it was very obvious from a very early time to the United States that what was happening really was contrary to US values as far as human rights were concerned. And of course, looking through a realist lens, it was seen as necessary in order to withstand insurgencies and a potential communist takeover. The US Army of the Americas was the main school, which a lot of run by the US Army, which trained a lot of the officers across Latin American militaries, which then subsequently engaged in atrocities. You might still see bumper stickers on the US Army School of the Americas, like you can see here. So it's a very controversial institution at the time, and still is. It's been relocated now back to the United States, away from Panama, so it was in Panama. The curriculum, counterinsurgency, psychological warfare, intelligence gathering, really everything you need in order to fight non-state actors. Now, one example, covert action in Chile between 63 and 73, the CIA spent a lot of money in an effort to influence the Chilean presidential election. So again, if you're looking at, in 2016, the alleged Russian interference in US elections, everybody does that. Everybody did that during the Cold War. This was what the CIA did for a living during the Cold War. This is what intelligence agencies still are very much engaged in. So we see, of course, this kind of new Cold War between the United States and Russia the last couple of years. But this is what intelligence agencies have been doing to influence, obviously to gather information, but really to steer political developments in a foreign country which would best represent the interests of your own government rather than of the people in that country. What did the CIA money buy in Chile? Manipulation of the press, large-scale support for Chilean political parties, manipulating public opinion polls. This gives you the normal scope of activities on a day-to-day. Placement of station-dictated materials in the Chilean media through propaganda, assets, direct support of publications, and efforts to oppose communist and left-wing influence in student, peasant, and labor organizations. So really infiltrating public opinion, media, and non-state organizations which were seen as perhaps benign to communist or socialist ideals. So this was, day-to-day, work of the CIA station in Chile, and of course, it led then to the overthrow of the Chilean government in '72, and Augusto Pinochet, became the ruler after '72. And this is what we see throughout. Looking at 59, 91, we see the proliferation of these military governments across Latin America. This is a rather good quote by Kissinger under Nixon, Secretary of State. Look, our basic attitude is what we would like you to succeed. I have an old-fashioned view that friends ought to be supported. What is not understood in the US is that you have a civil war. We read about human rights problems, but not the context. The quicker you succeed, the better. That was Kissinger reassuring the Argentinian ambassador. Argentina, of course, had a military dictatorship at the time. By the 1980s, it became a bit more public. We had more testimonies at the Organization for American States, which really contradicted the narrative the US government had put out there. And of course, those regimes had put out there that these were kind of rogue elements, bad eggs in the military, when it really was policy by these. So these were concerted efforts. Now, under Reagan, the idea of a US foreign policy towards Latin America changed again. Of course, Carter was criticized, for failing to prevent undecided outcomes, and largely, as far as Reagan was concerned, having failed in Latin America. The most important person shaping Reagan's foreign policy towards the region was Sean Kirkpatrick. She was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and she wrote in Foreign Affairs the article "Dictatorships and Double Standards." And in it, she makes the case that, we actually, there is such a thing as a moderate autocrat. If they're friendly to American interests, then we ought to support them. And this is what she said, that Carter failed to prevent the undecided outcomes. It actively collaborated in the replacement of moderate autocrats friendly to American interests with less friendly autocrats of extremist persuasion. So again, right-wing regimes were ultimately seen as favorable to US interest than socialist governments, even if those governments were democratically elected socialist governments. So it was a policy shift towards a lot more covert coercion, and then what there was also no appreciation of what was happening was really political development in those countries. These socialist groups, they had long-standing socioeconomic divisions and experienced political alienation by these regimes. So this was really a blanket check type of policy, seeing everything within the prism of the Cold War, and how we can manage that we have these these client states, no matter how anti-democratic and no matter what appalling human rights standard they would have. This also extended in more coercive action. The invasion of Grenada was rather unpopular invasion. Government in Grenada fell. What was seen as a communist-leaning regime. U.S. forces invaded Grenada and restored the government to one which would be more benign to the United States. The Iran-Contra scandal, which we'll discuss in a different module, but it exposed the executive crimes committed by Reagan in Latin America. A lot of money being given to El Salvadorian security forces at the time. Looking at this was during the El Salvadorian Civil War, and Kissinger Commission said in '98. U.S. security interests in Latin America require a significantly larger program of military assistance. So even looking at, end of the Cold War, almost a decade after the end of the Cold War, this type of mentality was still very much present in realists like Kissinger in particular, which really viewed Latin America through the lens of realpolitik, of power politics. Now, if you're looking at going back to Kennedy all the way to Reagan, we really see the irony of U.S. foreign policy. If you look at the 60s, We had commitments to democracy. The U.S. had pledged this commitment to democracy, but we saw this proliferation of autocracies. So the very opposite happened of what the U.S. wanted. When Reagan started to fully embrace his support for right-wing autocrats, we witnessed this wave of democratization. So whatever the United States wanted to do and did and worked towards, the opposite happened. And one answer for that would be the three waves of democratization forwarded by Huntington. If you're looking at the first period, 1828 and 1926, this was the period of universal suffrage, democratic developments in Europe, the United States too. 43, 62. So that was the end of the end of the Second World War. We saw the creation of new democratic governments, Germany, Japan, elsewhere across Europe, and then 74, 91, and that is the third wave. We see the fall of Eastern European communist countries, and then of course the fall of the Soviet Union itself in the late 80s, early 90s. And really Latin America fit within that third wave, political cultural developments were just right. Looking at the Pope was a champion of democratization at the time. He was Polish. And that, of course, culturally, Catholicism and the voice of the Pope, certainly resonated with a lot of people in Latin America. So this is one possible answer of, if you look at what the United States did, and it was always the exact opposite what took place. So if you look at U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America, it really is a story of power politics. Communist threat was seen as a major obstacle to U.S. interest, and anything was on the table in order to withstand a communist takeover in Latin America. By the 1990s, every country except Cuba had experienced elections, what we attributed to the third wave, and power as the main ingredient in U.S. foreign policy was very evident. Now again, if you're looking at the cost, the normative cost, looking at the testimonies, looking at declassified documents, that the families of the dead and hurt, you could say are beyond repair, looking at the extent of human rights violations, war crimes across Latin America committed by state actors and non-state actors, certainly came at a great cost for those governments, and ultimately also for U.S. foreign policy. Now the assignment I have for you is to go on the website, on the link I put on, it's on the George Washington National Security Archive. You click on Latin America here, and you see that you have a rather extensive selection of different declassified documents. As example, U.S. policy in Guatemala. Now the again, several documents. The assignment will be to record yourself a 2-minute speech, pretend that you are this CIA station chief in any of those Latin American countries during the Cold War. What was your counsel to the National Security Archive, to the president? What was the assessment of the time? What it is you wanted the U.S. government to do? So that is an assignment. Upload a 2-minute video of yourself, referring to whichever documents you can pick, whichever documents you see from here. Have fun.